First, some very basic sources. The Torah tells us in Devarim or Deuteronomy, Rak hishomer lecho u'shemor nafshecha me'od. Only beware for yourself and greatly beware for your soul. We have a similar concept of V'nishmartem ba'od l'nafsho seichem. There is the obligation of a person to protect their health, not to expose themselves unnecessarily to danger. And another pasuk, another verse in the Torah, related to a verse which was cited this morning by Rabbi Tendler, the Torah says, V'ach estimchem lenafsho seichem edrosh. Your blood, which belongs to your souls, I will demand. And the Talmud in Baba Kama comments, Miyad nafsho seichem edrosh estimchem. I will demand your blood if shed by your own hands. In other words, we don't have proprietary ownership over our own bodies. A person cannot make a decision to commit suicide. We don't have the right to do that. God has given us life, and we are obligated to live out this life for whatever short period of time we have been granted to have our sojourn upon this earth. But it is certainly not our decision to take our own lives. There is a limitation when it comes to autonomy in the eyes of halacha. The source at the bottom of the page, taken from Malachim Beis or Kings 2, is a source which is used to establish that under certain circumstances, a person is allowed to take the risk of perhaps ending life earlier if that produces the possibility of extending life. There's a term, chayei shah. Chayei shah is when the person is expected to live for a limited period of time. Different definitions, that may be that the person is expected to die within 12 months, within 6 months, different possible definitions. And the issue is, if I am expected to die within a relatively short period of time, am I permitted to expose myself to a risk in the hopes of lengthening my life? In the scenario here, there were 4 Mitzrayim, 4 lepers who were outside of the city. The camp of Aram had placed a siege against the city, and there was a terrible famine. These lepers were outside because lepers remained outside the city. But they reached the point where they had absolutely no food left, and they knew that if they didn't find food immediately, they would die. So the question was, should they remain where they are and die of famine, which would certainly happen very quickly, or should they go to the enemy camp and put themselves at the mercy of the enemy and see perhaps the enemy would be compassionate, give them food, and allow them to live. Actually, the enemy camp had been destroyed miraculously, but they were unaware of that at that moment. And if you look at the citation from the prophet, we are told, they said one to the other, why should we sit here until we die? If we enter the city, there's a famine in the city, and we will die there. If we remain here, we will die. So let us now go and throw ourselves upon the camp of Aram. If they let us live, we will live. And if they put us to death, we will die. Can I have the next slide, please? Based upon this citation, the Gemara, the Talmud in Avodah Zarah, derives an important principle. But the Talmud asks and challenges what these 4 lepers did. How could they do such a thing? How could they make a decision to expose themselves to the possibility of being killed by the enemy, even if they were destined to die of famine? But there was at least a certain period of time during which they would live. If they would go to the enemy camp, it was very possible that they would be put to death immediately. So how about the life of the hour, or the temporary life, which they certainly could have lived without going to the enemy camp, which they are now placing into jeopardy by proceeding to the enemy? And the Gemara tells us, Alalav lechaye sha'a lo chayshinan. So this implies that we are not to consider temporary life when there is the possibility of extending life, when there is the fear that the person will imminently die without some intervention. Even if that intervention might somehow hasten the death, there is a license to undertake that.